It was an ordinary Thursday night at Riverside Grill, a respected restaurant near the waterfront in Chicago. The soft glow of amber lamps reflected in polished glassware, and the gentle hum of conversations blended with the aroma of roasted coffee and warm dishes leaving the kitchen. The place had a timeless feel, the type of restaurant that carried stories in its walls, stories that only regulars could sense. The tables were filled, but everything moved with a calm rhythm, as though every staff member knew exactly how the night should flow. Among the servers was Sarah Miller, a woman in her late 20s with graceful steps and a look of quiet determination. She moved between the tables with practiced ease, balancing trays as if she were performing a delicate dance. Years earlier, she had studied music, dreaming of becoming a violinist on important stages. Life, bills, and responsibilities pushed that dream aside, and instead of a bow and strings, she held trays and menus. Still, in her gestures remained signs of her past life. Her fingers, slim and precise, held plates and glasses with the sensitivity of someone who once dedicated hours to mastering beautiful but demanding melodies. In her small apartment a few blocks away, her violin sat in the corner, gathering dust. She would look at it sometimes, imagining her younger self, filled with energy, believing the world was waiting for her music. But reality had changed her direction, and she accepted it without bitterness, though not without longing. Sitting in one of the corner tables was Michael Turner, a man in his mid-50s, known in business circles as a self-made billionaire who built a large tech company from nothing. To strangers, he looked like the very picture of success. His suit was impeccable, his watch expensive, his posture confident. Yet behind the polished exterior, there was a quiet exhaustion. For decades, his life had been dominated by deals, deadlines, screens, and numbers. He had everything many people wanted, but inside, he felt something had slipped away. He could not quite explain what it was, only that something once alive in him had grown silent. He sat alone, drinking a glass of red wine slowly, barely noticing its flavor. He seldom allowed himself moments away from work, but tonight he needed silence, or as close to it as a restaurant could offer. As the night progressed, customers finished their meals and the restaurant gradually emptied. Sarah took a moment to breathe as she passed near a wall decorated with old photographs and vintage items. Among them was an antique violin, hanging slightly crooked, its wood faded and varnish dull. She had walked past it thousands of times, but tonight her eyes stopped on it longer than usual. Something stirred inside her, a mix of nostalgia and impulse she could not fully understand. She stepped closer and gently lifted it from the wall. The weight of the instrument felt strangely familiar, as if time had folded and she was once again the hopeful student she used to be. Before she realized what she was doing, she positioned it under her chin. Her heart pounded. She had not played in years, and yet her hands remembered. She drew the bow across the strings. The first note broke the quiet gently, like a small ray of sunlight touching water at dawn. Conversations faded, forks paused mid-air, and even the kitchen staff stopped moving for a moment. The violin was slightly out of tune, and her bow trembled from lack of practice. But the sound was real, raw, and filled with something deep that words could not express. Michael looked up, startled. Something inside him reacted before his mind could analyze. The melody was simple and fragile, but within it was sincerity, warmth, and the kind of purity he had forgotten existed. The music spoke of childhood memories, of simpler days, of feelings untouched by the pressure of adult life. In that short moment, he realized how disconnected he had become from himself. Sarah played, losing herself in the sound. With each note, she regained a piece of the person she thought she had left behind. And when the last vibration faded into silence, she opened her eyes slowly, almost uncertain of what she had just awakened inside the room and inside herself. For a few seconds, the restaurant remained suspended in silence, as if the final note still echoed in the air. Sarah lowered the violin slowly, her breath unsteady, surprised at herself. She had not expected anything special. She had only followed an impulse, a simple need to feel again what she once believed she had lost forever. Then she heard something unexpected, quiet applause, scattered at first and then growing stronger. The sound washed over her with the warmth she had not felt in years. Michael was among the people clapping, though his reaction came from somewhere deeper than admiration for a performance. He felt something loosen in his chest. The melody reminded him of emotions he had pushed aside during years of nonstop competition and pressure. He remembered the boy he once was before ambition consumed him, the boy who used to draw, read poetry, play piano simply because he loved the sound of it. Without realizing, he whispered to himself that he could not remember the last time he felt anything that did not involve a contract, a number, or a shareholder. Sarah tried to return to her routine, but the lightness in her body made her feel almost unfamiliar to herself. One of the elderly regular customers touched her arm gently and whispered that she should never stop playing. The words pierced her softly, awakening questions she had avoided for a long time. A few minutes later, Michael asked to speak with her. She approached his table, unsure of what to expect. He looked at her not with the detached gaze of a wealthy man used to being served, but with the vulnerable sincerity of someone who had been hit by something unexpected. He said he wanted to understand. What had made her leave music? Why did someone who played with such feeling end up working in a restaurant? Sarah hesitated. Part of her felt embarrassed to reveal the truth, but something in his face told her that he was not asking out of curiosity, but recognition. So she told him. She explained how her parents struggled with money, how she needed a job to survive, how responsibilities demanded stability, and how slowly, without ever deciding, she walked away from her instrument. She expected pity or polite encouragement. Instead, Michael nodded with a look that said he understood more than she imagined. Then he shared something he seldom told anyone. He confessed that his success cost him relationships, hobbies, joy, and everything that had once made him feel human. He placed his elegant watch on the table as if it weighed too much and said that somewhere along the way he stopped living and only maintained momentum. Their conversation was interrupted by the restaurant manager calling Sarah. Another table needed attention. Michael leaned back in his chair, watching her walk away. Something inside him had awakened, something he had not felt since he built his company with excitement instead of survival instinct. He realized that despite all his achievements, he had never created anything that moved people the way a simple melody did. That night, he stayed longer than usual, staring at the empty stage in the corner where the restaurant occasionally hosted small performers. He imagined Sarah standing there, playing not for tips or survival, but because she belonged there. The idea stirred something bold inside him. Meanwhile, in the small employee locker room, Sarah put on her coat and touched her fingers lightly, remembering the sensation of the strings beneath them. For the first time in many years, she wondered what would happen if she tried again,
not to chase glory or fame, but simply to reclaim a part of herself. She walked out into the cold night air and felt the city breathing around her. Chicago lights glowed against the river, and she felt as if the entire city was encouraging her to take the steps she had abandoned. She smiled quietly, not yet knowing what tomorrow would bring. But Michael already knew that tomorrow might change everything. He stepped outside, took a long breath, and felt a decisive spark he had not felt in decades. He did not know where the path led, but he knew he had just turned onto it.
The next evening, Riverside Grill moved through its routine like always. Yet for two people, the air felt different. Sarah arrived early, long before her shift, unable to shake the thoughts that kept her awake half the night. She stood outside the restaurant doors holding her old case, the same violin she had once put away, believing she would never return to it. She was not sure what had pushed her to bring it, only that the music inside her was no longer willing to remain silent. She slipped inside quietly and sat alone at one of the tables before anyone else arrived. She opened the worn case and touched the violin with the care of someone reconnecting with an old friend. As she pressed her fingers along the neck of the instrument, a wave of emotion passed through her. It was not just longing, it was fear. What if she had waited too long? What if her hands no longer remembered what her heart did? Before she could continue, she heard footsteps. Michael had arrived early as well. He did not look like a billionaire tonight. His shoulders were relaxed, his tie loosened. Something in his expression seemed clearer, as if shedding the endless weight he always carried. When he saw the violin on the table, his eyes softened with understanding. He sat down across from her and spoke gently. He told her he had spent most of the night thinking about how success had turned into a prison. He confessed that his early years were driven by love for innovation and creation, yet somewhere along the way, everything became about profit, deadlines, and the next achievement. He told her that listening to her music reminded him of who he once wanted to be and who he still could be if he dared to step out of the mold he had built around himself. Though Sarah felt moved, she also felt exposed. She admitted that she did not know if she could truly return to music. She had bills, responsibilities, and fears, and she no longer knew how to dream without consequences. Michael listened, truly listened, and then said something unexpected. He told her that even the greatest dreams meant nothing if they cost a person's soul. The words hit her with surprising force because she knew he was not speaking only about her. But just as a moment of connection formed, the restaurant manager entered, surprised to find employees chatting before the shift. His reaction was not friendly. He viewed Sarah's violin as a distraction. He reminded her sharply that she was hired to work, not perform, and warned that personal activities during business hours would not be tolerated. The frustration in his voice revealed something deeper. He believed dreams were for children, not adults who needed to survive. Sarah apologized and put the violin away while her manager walked off without waiting for her response. The excitement she had carried into the restaurant now clouded with something darker. She felt the familiar pressure of real life pulling her back to the ground she thought she had left yesterday. For a moment, she wondered if she had been foolish to believe anything could change. Michael saw her expression and felt anger rise inside him. He had lived under similar voices for decades, voices that told him to be realistic, responsible, and productive, but never joyful. He knew that if she listened to that tone long enough, she would bury her spark again, perhaps forever. But he also sensed that forcing change at the wrong moment could break her rather than free her, so he said nothing. Instead, he stood up and walked toward the exit, but not before turning back one last time.
He told her quietly that the world often needed people who dared to do what others were afraid to do. Then he left. But his steps were not those of defeat. They were determined. Sarah continued her shift with a heavy heart. The customers were kind, the food smelled wonderful, and the night flowed smoothly. Yet she felt distant from everything around her. It was as if playing music had opened a doorway inside her, and now she could not pretend it was not there. When the final customers left and the chairs were stacked, she remained alone for a moment, standing in the middle of the quiet dining room. She clasped her hands together, unsure whether she had just awakened a dream or stepped closer to a painful fall. All she knew was this: the safe path no longer felt like living, and stepping back into the unknown terrified her more than staying where she was. Outside, the city light shimmered on the river and the winter air hit her face. She walked home slowly, torn between fear and a faint hope that refused to die. She did not yet know that the turning point had already begun, not in the restaurant, but in the decisions forming quietly inside her, and inside Michael as well.
The following week passed quietly, but nothing inside Sarah was quiet anymore. She worked her shifts, served customers, smiled as she always had, but her heart was no longer in the routine. Each night she returned home and opened the violin case, practicing for a few minutes at first, then for longer as her courage grew. The strings were stiff, her bows scraped in places that once flowed, but little by little she felt the music returning to her hands, to her body, and to the part of her spirit she had forced into silence. Michael, on the other hand, found himself unable to return to life as usual. He attended board meetings, reviewed reports, and signed documents, but something inside him had shifted. For years, he had measured worth in quarterly growth and acquisitions, yet now those numbers looked flat and lifeless. For the first time in a long while, he questioned the cost of his success. He remembered his early days building his company from his bedroom, dreaming of helping people, creating tools that brought joy and opportunity. Somewhere along the way, he had stopped creating and started only maintaining. One night, he returned to Riverside Grill, not for food, but for clarity. The restaurant was half full, the familiar lamps glowing against polished surfaces. Sarah was working, but this time her smile was real. She had changed in small ways. She stood straighter, moved with confidence, and carried a lightness that came not from certainty, but from choosing her own path again. During a small break in the evening, she saw Michael sitting alone and approached him. He told her he had made a decision. He was stepping back from day-to-day leadership of his company. He needed space to reconnect with life, inspiration, and humanity. He said the world was full of people owning everything, yet feeling nothing, and he no longer wanted to be one of them. Sarah listened in silence, shocked but deeply respectful. She knew that taking such a step required more courage than most people realized. Then Michael looked at the small stage in the corner and asked a question that made her breath tremble for a moment. He asked if she would be willing to play again tonight, not for the crowd, not for tips, but for herself. She stood very still, her heart racing. She had been practicing alone for days, but playing in front of people again felt terrifying. Still, she knew the truth. She had come too far to hide again. She nodded. The restaurant grew quiet as she climbed onto the small stage with her violin. Some guests looked up curiously. Others paused with their forks halfway to their mouths. The lights were warm and soft, shining against the worn wood beneath her feet. She closed her eyes for a moment and took a deep breath. Then she began to play. The first notes were not perfect, but they were alive. They carried fragility at first, then strength, then something deeper, the sound of someone rediscovering their purpose. The room became still, conversations fading into a soft hush. Michael felt his throat tighten.
He was watching someone reclaim something precious he had allowed his own life to steal from him. As the melody unfolded, Sarah felt a wave of relief, emotion, and truth rise through her. The music reminded her of the promise she once made to herself, not to be famous, not to earn applause, but to stay connected to who she really was. When the final note fell into silence, she lowered the violin slowly, unsure of how the room would react. The applause was not loud but heartfelt. People nodded with genuine respect, as if they had witnessed something rare and personal. Sarah smiled, her chest full and steady. For the first time in many years, she felt she was exactly where she belonged. Later that night, while closing the restaurant, she found herself alone for a moment. She looked at the violin in her hands and whispered a quiet thank you, not to fate, not to luck, but to herself. For listening, for trying, for choosing not to let her dream die quietly. Michael approached her before leaving. He told her that although they came from different paths, they both needed the same thing, a new beginning. They exchanged a final smile, not of romance, but of mutual recognition and deep respect. They had changed each other's lives simply by reminding one another of what truly matters. Outside, Chicago lights reflected on the river as the cold night breeze swept through the streets. Sarah walked home with her violin case in hand, but now the case held more than wood and strings. It held possibility. This story reminds us that it is never too late to pick up what we once put down. Sometimes one moment, one song, one decision can awaken what years of routine had buried. And sometimes the smallest act of courage can change not only one life, but two. If you enjoyed this story and want more true and inspiring tales like this, follow the channel and join us for the next journey.